Our often simplistic presentations of biblical figures like Gideon and Samson can obscure the fact that the book in which they feature, Judges, is a grim exploration of Israel's inability to remain faithful to their covenant with God and the resulting consequences for the nation. By contrast, the book which immediately follows Judges, Ruth, is brimming with displays of covenant faithfulness. My name is Kenny Innes, and in this episode of TheoDisc, I'll be talking with Alister Wallace about how these two books ought to be read together and how women and the treatment of women are vital to the theological trajectory of them both. Alister teaches Introduction to Old Testament on WTC's Cert HE and BA programs. He has a degree in Public Policy and Management from the University of Ulster, one in Divinity from Union Theological College, and also has a Master's in Theology and PhD from Queen's University Belfast. He regularly works with missions organisations and access-restricted nations, training pastors and teaching the Old Testament. He's also a pastor with Christian Fellowship Church in Northern Ireland and currently co-leads our Antrim site with his wife, who happens to be named Ruth. Please help us reach as many people as possible by subscribing and sharing TheoDisc with your friends. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Well, I'm delighted to have on TheoDisc today Alister Wallace. Alister, who teaches Old Testament with us at WTC. Welcome, Alister. It's good to have you.
Good to be along with you, Kenny.
Yeah. So when I asked Alister if he'd like to come on, he pretty immediately sprung to Judges and Ruth. And so that's what we're going to explore a little bit later, some of the connection points between the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. But before we do that, Alister has to run the gauntlet of three questions. He's already sweating.
Yeah.
3 questions, Alister, just so we can get to know you a little bit better. And so this is things that you return to, constants in your life. And so the 3 categories that we'd like you to think about. The first is a book. You can't, by the way, choose a biblical text.
Okay.
Right, that's cheating.
Cheating?
Because you just come up with Judges and or Ruth, which would be double cheating in this podcast. A meal and a place. So first of all, what's a book that you always return to?
Well, I suppose one that I've read a few times is a little book by R.T. Kendall, actually, called God Meant It for Good, sort of based around the story of Joseph. And I suppose I read it over 20 years ago at a particularly difficult time in my life, and just how it really spoke to me at the time and challenged me in various sort of attitudes and stuff that was going on with me at the time. So it's got a wee special place for me, and I've read it a few times, recommended it a few times to different people in different situations. So that's one, God Meant It for Good.
Brilliant. And a meal or a kind of food.
Oh, well, so we travel to Asia quite a bit and do some work out there with different churches, and especially in Thailand. So a red Thai curry with duck and pineapple would be that'd be one of my favorite all-time meals. Something I even try to cook myself at home, but it's when I go there, it's one I always go for.
It's not quite as good back home as it is in Thailand.
No, it's never as good, no, but it's worth the effort, though.
And what about a place that you return to?
Oh, place. Well, I suppose I'm a County Antrim boy, so I have to talk about the Glens of Antrim and the Causeway Coast. But in the middle of all that, there's a lovely wee village called Glenarm, which has a beautiful forest walk, and that's somewhere my wife and I would be quite regularly, probably even once a month, just for. Wow. It's a great place to walk and talk, shall we say?
Brilliant. Oh, great. Thanks, Alister.
Yeah. Now
we know you, so you're allowed to go further on the podcast.
Go further. Great.
In the kind of short time that we have, we're going to look a little bit at Judges and Ruth. Now, you teach Old Testament at WTC, but what is it about, let's say, Judges that you return to? Because it's an odd book.
Yeah, it's got many facets to it. I think it's got the whole gambit of human behavior in there, apart from everything else. We've got the usual sort of controversial ones, money, sex, and power, all having their play with different characters. But I suppose even last year, teaching the Book of Judges primarily, even some of the questions the students realised I don't know this quite as well as I thought I did, because there's a few aspects I'm still wrestling with within the text,
Yeah.
and. So that's part of a motivation for it. But I think it's one of the ones when you talk to people, they find it very, very difficult. It's like, how does God allow all this stuff to go on? And the people of God, some of the great heroes of the faith, and some of their behaviors, which is quite shocking at times.
Yeah.
So how do you marry those two things up? I think probably I know you had Nick on there recently in one of your podcasts talking about how people have the gifts of the Spirit and the anointing of the Holy Spirit, but yet their behavior sometimes doesn't match up with this. And we find this within the Book of Judges. These great men and women of God, and who's some of them their character doesn't match up the gifting and calling that God has given them,
Yeah.
and we see the disastrous consequences of that.
I mean, it is interesting that there are elements of Judges that we are very familiar with
Yes.
because people like Gideon and Samson are taught, that's your Sunday school
Yeah.
staples right there. And yet, when you actually go and read the text as it is, you
Yes.
suddenly find that what we think we know is quite different to what's presented in the
Well,
text itself.
exactly. You mentioned Gideon there. The whole story is very famous. But when you get into it, he is later called Jerubbaal. The one who pulls down Baal. But
Hmm.
yet, when he takes the money, what does he do? But he makes an idol for himself out of an effort. So it's this sort of he's doing these great things for God, but yet at the same time, the influences of idolatry and his own sort of power and esteem comes into all that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's zoom out for a second
Yeah.
and just maybe think about what would you see then as the central themes running through Judges?
Well, I think traditionally sort of the analysis of it in three parts. You have that sort of general introduction, and then we have the sort of six major sin cycles, and then we have this epilogue at the end of the two Levites and how they're dealing with. So you've got all that in terms of the detail, but I think most of it, what I'm thinking is it takes us back to the covenant, and how Israel has not lived up to the covenant, and you reach this high point just before it in Joshua, where Joshua's renewing the covenant. And I suppose if you're familiar, we're familiar with the sort of suzerain vassal treaty of the covenant. Where Yahweh is a suzerain. He's the
Hmm.
protector and the provider. He's provided for Israel up to now, and all that Israel have to do, their part of the bargain is, just you're only allowed one suzerain, you're only allowed one Lord. Keep to the covenant, no other gods before me. And yet this runs through the whole of Judges that the people are seemingly, rather than pushing out the people with their idols, they have become Canaanized themselves and absorbed the idolatry of the nation that they've been given by God. So I think the big thing that all the people all throughout the text, they're being tested all the time on, is Yahweh truly king?
Mm.
And this big gap in their behavior that by abandoning the covenant and not keeping their side of the bargain. Yet all the way through it, well, especially at the start, we're told God has been faithful to his covenant, has never ceased in his faithfulness to it. But yet even the writer, and I think it's in the early part of chapter 2, where he sets us up and he basically tells us what's going to happen in the rest of the book.
Right.
We're going to deteriorate here. You're going to see bad stuff. The people have ignored God, we've ignored the covenant, and it just we enter this sort of downward spiral of the six sort of sin cycles from that.
Yeah.
But I say I take a lot of it back to the covenant, or lack of covenant faithfulness to Yahweh.
Yeah, because even at the beginning there is this statement that a generation had arisen who did not
Mm,
know the Lord.
yeah.
So there's some sense in which that generation that came out, Joshua's generation, didn't pass on this knowledge of God and the covenant.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's part of the. I mean, if you even go right back to Moses and the original Sinai covenant, I mean, part of it, and again, it's an element of the suzerain vassal treaties. The covenant is meant to be repeated to the people. It's something you always sort of bring to remembrance, etc. And
Yeah.
so that's a major feeling that's highlighted straight away in the book of Judges. Even, this short passage of time from Joshua, and we've now moved into a period of time where, whilst the covenant is there, we haven't sort of brought it to the attention of the people who are going to succeed us. And it's a major feeling of them. And that's probably, it's a feeling of our churches as well.
Mm,
Sometimes, we fail to pass on the great covenant that we have in Christ.
yeah.
We're always to, if you think of Jesus's words, even when he's establishing that, it's this do in remembrance of me. So
Yeah.
the remembrance of the covenant is so important. It's not just the teaching; it's the covenant itself becomes the centerpiece of it all. I think we lose that even in our Christianity at times. We get tied up with many other things in the periphery and forget the centrality of just how much that covenant means to us. It should be the basis of everything and the thing we always fall back towards.
And so in Judges, you have this sense in that God seems to be raising up individuals
Yes.
with this intention of this will surely return the people back into covenant with
Yeah.
him.
And we see the cycle as it repeats, because after each one of them, well, when the judge dies, well, there's a certain period of peace, usually 40 years or 80 years, and then they lapse again. So again, that generational peace, 40 years is generally sort of accepted as a generation within the Old Testament. So, it's like, again, the generation didn't pass it on to the next one, and hence the cycle begins again and becomes even worse.
And how successful, I mean, those judges, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, you have Othniel at the beginning,
Yeah,
who seems to be kind of like this archetypal judge. Everything
yeah,
kind of seems to go well with
yep.
him. It's a very short
Very,
narrative.
very short narrative, and
Yeah,
and the connection obviously with Caleb there
yeah,
as well through his daughter. Yep,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, and then we move into Deborah later on.
yeah.
And again, and Deborah, she's a fascinating one as well, because the word for judge actually means leader, probably more so than the typical idea we have of judge as somebody sitting in a courtroom with a wig on.
Right.
But we do see that in her, though. She sits under the tree, named after her, the tree of Deborah, and she's almost Moses-esque, I think, because
Yeah.
she's one of the few people that sort of takes that role of, you know, uh, actioning between the people, making decisions. There were sort of legal decisions, but also prophesying. So
Hmm.
there's very few other people in the Old Testament I would say, would have that sort of stature that Deborah would have. And so I think, in terms of the whole idea of women in leadership, here's a woman who's almost on the same stature as Moses and carrying out the same functions of Moses, slipped in amongst all these other men who tend to fail, which
Yeah.
she sort of stands in stark contrast to the guys that follow her in the text anyway.
Yeah. We'll maybe cycle back to that idea
Yeah, yeah,
because you do then after that get this kind of degradation where Gideon comes, which seems to begin well, but even within Gideon's story, you get these little hints as it goes
uh-huh.
along that he's not quite as got quite the strength of character that they often present
Yeah.
that he does.
Well, obviously, even even the various fleeces and stuff sort of shows maybe a lack of faith, and
Yeah,
it's I suppose it's quite surprising why he gets a mention later on, in the book of Hebrews as one of the heroes. And is it a case maybe he gets mentioned as here's a man who's so weak, but yet faith in Yahweh made him strong. Maybe that's the reason
yeah,
I can't understand. And I think it maybe mentioned, well, I haven't mentioned before, but the whole idea of even Barak gets a mention in Hebrews, whereas why does Deborah not? There's a
yeah,
question, why is she left out? When she shows more faith in what God's going to do than what he does. He has this great victory, which is fantastic. But then he names, the people want him to make him king, and it's like, oh no, no, I couldn't possibly be king. But yet he names one of his sons. My father is King Abimelech. So
yeah,
you got this sort of false humility almost coming through as well, which is quite funny.
yeah,
And then the disaster that happens with Abimelech himself. He, they say there's the anointed and the self-appointed. Well, Abimelech seems to, appoints himself as king.
yeah,
And the disaster that comes out of all that there, and the bloodshed that comes out of it, it's horrendous what he gets up to in the middle
yeah,
of this. So it's always, like you said, that the pinnacle is right at the start of, and I think it's probably written in that way. My understanding of the Book of Judges, it's not in a chronological order as
sure,
such, but it is written such a way to show us the overall moral decline
yeah,
and how bad it gets before Samuel comes on the scene
Yeah.
later on.
By the time you get to Samson,
Uh-huh.
there's another of our great
Oh,
heroes of
yeah.
the faith. But Samson just it seems to be that kind of inverse pinnacle of the move from Israel of devotion or relationship with Yahweh to complete self interest. Samson's
Oh,
just all
absolutely.
about
Yeah,
himself.
it's all about him, and even his acts of violence, which I think some point out, well, is that God empowering him to do that?
Right.
Or is it just him? He has this strength that God has given him, and he uses it to ill effect. And I think it's probably more the latter than the
Mm.
former. I don't
Hmm.
think, because yeah, he flies off the handle almost at times. He doesn't get his way, and he just kills people. Sometimes I've said this almost in a humorous way, but it's quite if you're in that scene and you're the person at the end of what he's doing, it's horrendous what he's done. Even
Yeah.
though we say, well, it's only the Philistine. No, no, these are people created in the image of God, and you're just killing them out of spite, out of your bad temper. And
Yeah.
so it's in terms of his character, it's awful what it's portraying. It's
Yep.
almost exactly what you shouldn't be, as a Christian leader, or sorry, as a godly leader. This is not what we would expect.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so so you've got this kind of narrative outline. Let's not forget
Uh-huh.
Ehud, who has that magnificent stabbing the king while he's on the toilet.
Yes,
Just the
yes.
that I loved that story when I was about 9 years old. So you have this progression as this central narrative
Hmm.
that's running
Yeah.
through. The judges who are supposed to restore Israel to
Yes.
Yahweh end up actually, in some senses, moving them further away from
Yeah.
Yahweh. But if you sit down and read the book,
Hmm.
you do get this clear sense of the importance and the impact of women
Yeah.
throughout the narrative, and it's clearly there. And maybe we can talk a little about what that's
Yeah.
about.
Well, if you think of most of Scripture up to this point, women don't seem to play such a prominent role, but yet they pop up all over Judges in various ways, and in ways which I think tend to show a positive side of women, even though they're being treated horrendously. Sometimes, for example, you get this little cameo of Caleb's daughter. And right at the start, you think, oh, so why is that in the text? Because it doesn't seem to add anything to the text other than it highlights this I think, very sort of independent, intelligent young woman who wants, her own means.
So
It's
she comes on her horse. She rides in
yes,
and argues for a greater
uh-huh,
piece of land than she's been
yeah.
given.
And it's funny how even people interpreting the text through the years have seen it because there's some texts will she actually asks her husband to ask her father for the land, but some of the scriptures will interpret that he asked her to ask her father, that he's taken the initiative. But I think if you read on, but I think the text that follows it, she then asks her father for the springs as well. So it would seem a little inconsistent to take that sort of view. I think it's probably more consistent to take the view she asks her husband to ask her father for the land, and then when she meets her father, ask for further springs. And I say it's showing that here's a girl with independent thought and wants independent means. And I think there's almost a little touch of the Proverbs 31 there. She
Yep.
asked to buy a field and to flourish it. So it's a woman, she's got a famous father and she's going to have a famous husband, but she's not sitting in the shadows, and she wants her own piece of the action, and she's blessed in the middle of it. What's that got to do with the rest of the judges, other than it's been inserted there, I think, to show a woman in a good light? And I suppose I know you've maybe looked in the past, the whole idea of both the books fitting within the Deuteronomic history, and
Hmm.
I think I was sitting yesterday. I would need to research this further, so I wouldn't build my house on it. But I sort of wonder, going back to Josiah's reforms, when Huldah the prophetess is consulted,
Yeah, and
about
Josiah
yeah.
finds the law, the copy.
Oops, we've forgotten this, and she draws them back to the covenant. It's this idea of going back to the covenant again, and I sort of wonder, in the writing of all, when we get to our final sort of canonical form that we have now, how much did she have an influence at this, if anything at all? I just think it's an interesting question. I'd love to. I'll probably need to research that a wee bit further now, but it just sort of occurred to me: could this be the reason why there's so many sort of positive? Uh, Influences of women within the text here.
Yeah.
Uh, and even the whole the text later on around jail and how she kills Sisera is fascinating in itself. Again, showing a woman again of independent thought and prepared to take her own actions and be responsible for them because her husband has sort of she's from the Canaanites or Kenites, and again in chapter 1 we get this little wee bit about the Kenites pitched their tent with the people of Judah. And then later, her husband, he pitches his tent probably over about 100 miles north of where they have originally arrived in Israel.
Right.
And he has made an alliance with the enemy king. And so when the whole scene, when Sisera comes to her tent, because her husband's made an unholy alliance with him and his king, she invites him into the tent. Now, some commentators have sort of suggested, oh, well, she sort of just decided in a spur of moment, we might as well throw our pitch back in with Israel because, Sisera's now on the losing side. I think there's more to it here. I think that she has been independent of her husband and, thought, no, she wants to pitch him with the God of Israel rather than the surrounding gods. And I think there's an element of that there. And there's almost a little parallel later on, I think, in Ruth. If you think of the idea of Elimelech leaving the town of Bethlehem and pitching his tent
Mm.
basically down with Moab, and it takes a Moabite then to bring the family back to
Right.
where they belong in Bethlehem. And so there's little parallels going on in those texts as well. But again, you've two women making big choices regarding the God that they serve. Is it Yahweh or is it the gods of the Canaanite region and the surrounding nations?
Yeah. And also alongside these kind of strong narratives of women, you also get these hints that become louder as the text progresses. So at the
Oh,
beginning, I think around about chapter 3, you have this sense of the Israelites taking their daughters and giving them as
yeah,
wives. So there's this the treating of women as kind of part of this
yeah,
bargaining structure with the other nations. And then you get even strong figures like the certain woman who throws the millstone that kills Abimelech. She
yes,
she remains nameless, which is
yes, nameless.
interesting.
Yeah,
And then as the text progresses, you find that there's more and more violence
yeah.
perpetrated against women. So what do you think narratively is being done there?
If we think of the sort of recurring motif at the end, that men were basically, there was no king in Israel, men did as they liked. The more, shall we say, that men spiral down in this behavior, the worse women get treated. And that sort of reaches its sort of high point or low point, should I say, with the Levite's concubine. From about chapter 19 on, and that's probably the most diabolical story of the lot. If you think even in the book of Hosea, where Hosea is prophesying just before the fall of the northern kingdom, and one of the things that he draws out is as if you've sunk to the depths of the men of Gibeah. That's the lowest point of our history to now, and yous have repeated it, and this is why Samaria is about to fall. Some people have interpreted that passage almost as if the poor Levite, is the victim here, and his wife, his concubine does this, and she gets treated. No, I think he's the villain of the piece. Here's a man. He's not just an ordinary man. This is a guy who's a Levite, the spiritual leadership of the country, and here's what he's done. And even taking for a Levite to take a concubine, I think that's probably not usually considered enough as well. What's a Levite doing with a concubine? If you think back to the law of the regulations, even around priests and the women they could marry or couldn't marry, and yet he's taken on a second class, what would be termed as a second class wife. So he's getting all the benefits of marriage without the commitment of a covenant, and this is how she gets treated. And even again, there's difficulties in around that passage of how some of the words are interpreted. Because at one point it says, well, if you read the NIV version, it says that she, I think, was unfaithful to him. Some some translations are even less kind to her, saying she harloted herself. But there's difficulties around the Hebrew language around that. And another interpretation is she was angry with him. And if you think of the next part of the text where he has to go and speak tenderly to her, now if she had, so I think there's a bit of a male bias with some of the
Right.
translations going
Yeah.
on there. As a man, we have to put our hands up to that and go, "Yep, that looks bad," because the flow of the text, I think, would suggest yes, he's made her angry, and that's why she left.
She's gone back
Uh,
to her dad.
she's gone back to her dad, and I guess that's so. For all married men to when it's speaking tenderly to your wife, it's usually because you've done something wrong, not the other way
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
And if she had been unfaithful in a more serious note, she probably would have been stoned to death. According to the law. So I think it's more of again, if we take that bias out of it and say, well, he's made her angry, he has to go and speak tenderly to her, and he goes off and speak. And it's interesting. We're comparing this into the book of Ruth. That's the same phrase that Ruth refers to Boaz. She's grateful for him speaking tenderly to her.
yeah,
It's that sort of lovely expression where Boaz, when he speaks tenderly to her, actually goes out of his way to protect Ruth. In this occasion, we have a Levite initially speaking tenderly to her and then treat her in the most abominable way possible. So there's a sort of a compare and a contrast going on between the two texts there as well.
you've got this idea then of covenant faithfulness
Yeah,
in Judges being abandoned, and
yeah,
as goes the nation in this unfaithfulness,
yeah,
the
absolutely.
mistreatment of women is amplified.
Yeah.
Then you turn the page
hmm
and you get the book of Ruth, which quite pointedly begins with "in the time of
In
the
the time of
judges."
the judges, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, again, I think I've read in various, there's a school of thought that thinks that, well, Ruth was written, post Ezra Nehemiah, to counter some of the stuff that Ezra and Nehemiah were doing in terms of kicking out the women who were from the surrounding nations where the people of Israel had intermarried. But I think it's much more the case of it's a counterbalance to what has gone on in Judges. As if Judges is saying, well, if when men do their own thing and we spiral to the bottom of the barrel, literally, uh, here's the counter piece to this. This is how women actually should be treated, and this is how God always intended it to be.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think there's it's a very big compare and contrast. This is the bad stuff that happens. Here's the really good bit when men live in covenant with Yahweh and live out that covenant faithfulness towards women and women towards men as well. I was reading it where Boaz speaks to Ruth and he says, may God repay you for the way you've treated your mother-in-law. And we just say, oh yeah, well, God will. It's almost like may God just bless you. But the word that's used in the Hebrew, it's related to the word shalom. I was looking at even in Strong's, it's almost trying to convey this idea of may you be in the covenant of peace. And it's almost as if he's speaking to her. She's now part of this covenant. She's come under the protection of Yahweh, under his wings.
Mm.
And this foreigner who shouldn't have anything to do with Israel at all has now come into covenant with Yahweh.
Yeah.
And he's speaking to her as a member of the covenant community. Here's a woman who, say, has been brought in from very far off, both spiritually and geographically, into the people of God in the most beautiful sort of way of covenant again. So it's being affirmed by a man here. She's being affirmed in the covenant as opposed to the outsider who's no right to be there.
Yeah. And yet it's not some kind of Cinderella story in that
No,
Ruth's not passive in this. In fact, she's the one who's kind of motivating a lot of this, isn't she?
Certainly, well, her mother-in-law as well
Yeah.
doesn't help. It's almost, put on your best dress, do your hair, put on the perfume, and and go to them on the threshing floor. And there's even, possible euphemisms around the
Hmm.
whole idea of the threshing floor, and even the danger that I think her mother-in-law puts her in by sending her there. This is a time of feasting. Men have lots of money in their pocket and wine in their belly. So to do what she's doing is she's taking a great risk, shall we say?
Yeah.
And but again, rather than Boaz taking advantage of her, the way that the likes of the concubine's been treated in this sort of diabolical fashion,
Mm.
Boaz does the opposite, and not just maintains her dignity and her purity in that sense, but makes sure that nobody else can even make the accusation against her. So that, yeah, again, it's this protective thing that Boaz is doing. He's showing her this covenant love and covenant faithfulness in what he's doing. So the Hebrew word hesed,
Mm,
sort of runs through the whole text, and as probably the best definition of that is covenant faithfulness. So
yeah,
she has shown covenant faithfulness to her mother-in-law, and Boaz in return shows it to her. And so it's again this when covenant works well, when you know that Yahweh is king, he's your provider and protector, you then can become in your identity in that, you become the protector and the provider for others, and demonstrate the hesed that he has shown you.
yeah. Because at the end of Judges, you have the virgins being sent out into the fields, you
Oh,
know, and they get taken away as part of
yeah,
this bargaining chip with the Benjamite tribe, and
yeah,
but here in Ruth, you have Ruth going out into the field and Boaz saying, "Don't anybody touch her,
yeah.
protect her, and allow her." And so you
Oh,
get
yeah.
this, and I thought about the Torah is not mentioned explicitly in the book of Ruth, but you
No.
seem to see the faithfulness God requires in the Torah kind of played out or lived out in
Well,
the
it's
narrative.
certainly lived out. I mean,
Yeah,
well, even the whole gleaning, goes back to the law. This was part of the requirement. So Boaz is faithful to that, and then we say it obviously later on. We know the whole thing of the sandalless one,
hmm,
where he goes and talks to the sort of the near relative, and again. Whilst the letter of the law would have actually have required Ruth to go and do that, I think he has sort of shown he's gone the extra mile, shall we say, in this case, because
yeah,
Ruth would have had the one that would, according to Deuteronomy, he would be, or she would be the one who would go before the elders. And can you imagine the whole scene of her facing rejection in front of all these men? That would be humiliating for her, as well as the other guy himself, because he's going to have his face spat upon and his
yeah.
sandal taken off him, etc. But Boaz seems to take so there's a letter of the law, but Boaz takes the better way.
And so both books end talking about kings. At the end of Judges, you have this idea there's no king in Israel,
Yeah.
right? And then at the end of Ruth, after this kind of expression of covenant faithfulness, you get this salvific hope that we find out that David comes, from Ruth.
Yes.
So
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, and actually, you take it through to the genealogy of Matthew's gospel. We have it all there, and yeah. But it's well, I suppose I like to think of that there as despite ourselves and
yeah,
despite man's feelings, the sovereignty of God, He's still working out His plans and purposes despite us, not because of us.
yeah,
And I think that's one of the great lessons of all the sort of the history of Israel up to this point.
yeah. So, Alice, as we kind of wrap this up here,
Yep.
let's just think quickly about. Obviously, there's a real strong thread here of women prominently appearing in both books, and this sense of God um, redeeming that part of the narrative. But I think there's also a wider sense as well of that sometimes when we come to the scriptures, we don't notice those things because we kind of tend to zoom in on certain things or make moral examples out of people that maybe we shouldn't, instead of reading kind of the broader narrative and see how things connect together. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. It's well, there's always value of doing the character studies and looking
Yeah,
at that individually, but I think you're right. To stand back and get the whole sort of well, what's God doing here? In this whole story? What's the text trying to tell us at this point? And the difficult parts, why is it impacting us in the way it's impacting us? What's the Holy Spirit saying us through this text? But I suppose part of the overall history, it's even going back to my book at the start. God meant it for good.
yeah,
I just thought of that there. It's this idea that the whole of history, God is working His purposes out. The big lessons, when we fail to walk in covenant with Him the way we're supposed to, this is where it leads us. Look at the depths that you can actually get to by doing this. But the Book of Ruth sort of highlights the other side of it. But look at the heights that we can rise when we act with covenant faithfulness towards Yahweh and to our neighbor.
yeah. And I love that scripture that says that even when we are unfaithful, that he is still faithful, and consistently calling us back to remember his faithfulness. And that's a great thing we can take from these two books.
Absolutely.
Well, Alister, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it. It's really insightful, and we've probably opened a can of questions for people. Yeah, but it would be a great encouragement for people to go and sit down and just read from Judges to the end of Ruth, and kind of look at how those two books connect and contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose one of the things I always say to the students, it's not just how God speaks to you through it. How does this text impact you, and why?
Yeah.
If it troubles you, it's troubling you for a good reason, and we should be wrestling with that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Alister, for being with us.
Kenny.
Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Well, thank you, Alister and Kenny, firstly for your beautiful Gaelic accents, and secondly for opening up the links between Judges and Ruth for us so that we can see the storylines intersecting clearly. Man, it makes you just want to delve even more into the Bible, doesn't it? In our next episode, we'll be welcoming Professor Andrew Parker, who will be chatting with Kenny about leading the way Jesus did. What does this mean for us, and is it genuinely possible to model Jesus' leadership style in our context? This is a must listen for anyone in any leadership position today. TheoDisc is part of WTC, a theological college that seeks to partner with the church through equipping and sending the whole people of God. Our innovative hub model allows you to study on any of our part-time programs without leaving your work or ministry. Come and find out more at wtctheology.org.uk. Thank you for listening to episode 23 of TheoDisc. Join us for episode 24 as Kenny chats with Andrew Parker about leading like Jesus. Bye for now.